Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn. Have you ever been browsing on Amazon and seen what looks like a $20 version of a $2,000 purse? Or seen a celebrity post a picture of herself in a trendy designer dress only to see $15 versions of the same thing pop up for sale on your social media feed just a few days later? In fashion, dupes refer to items that closely imitate the design, look, or style of a more expensive or designer piece, but are sold at a much lower price. Now, they're not exact counterfeits because they typically don't use the brand's name or logo, but they mimic the aesthetics or trends popularized by high end fashion labels. Are these legal? And when do dupes turn into knockoffs or counterfeits? What types of ethical questions do they raise? And what do some recent lawsuits tell us about the legal status of dupes? Here today to talk about this are two experts: Susan Scafidi, founder and director of the Fashion Law Institute, and intellectual property lawyer Elizabeth Dipchand. Thank you both so much for joining me today. Elizabeth, let's start with what the legal line is between a dupe and a counterfeit or a knockoff. Are these meaningful distinctions in law?
Well, I have to give you the answer that every lawyer dreads having to give a client, which is it depends. It always depends. And in fact, that bright line isn't so bright, it's pretty blurry. But what a dupe is versus a counterfeit, there's some really important hallmarks and highlights of that. A dupe is something that imitates, and it really has the hallmarks of being exactly the same thing as the more expensive product. Counterfeits and knockoffs, often you can tell they're just not from the same source. And there's a lot of kind of distinctions there that can be evident on the face of it. But sometimes dupes simply just look and feel and act in the exact same way as what they're trying to imitate. So the question is, when does imitation become problematic?
Elizabeth, there's a lot of different areas of Susan, there are a lot of different areas of intellectual property law. I mean, there's copyright, there's trademark, there's design patents. What are most commonly implicated in legal disputes over dupes versus counterfeits?
Sure, all areas of intellectual property law come to bear here, but we see trademarks most often. Trademarks are about, as you mentioned, those labels, those logos, and anything else that can tell the consumer where a product comes from. We see copyright occasionally in fashion, fabric prints, jewelry. We see patents on things that are useful, like once upon a time zippers or Velcro, and also design patents on the ornamental or aesthetic aspects of functional items like clothing. But mostly we spend our time when we're talking about dupes, and certainly always when we're talking about counterfeits, in the trademark realm.
Now, Elizabeth, what can you tell me about some real world examples where there have been lawsuits over dupe creators? I know there's a lawsuit right now alleging where Lululemon is alleging that Costco has created a dupe of a Lululemon bra. What can you tell me about what that claim involves?
There's a significant amount of burden that comes with fame. So when you see large organizations, they've had to contend with counterfeits for decades and decades and decades. This isn't necessarily new, but what's really interesting with this new Lululemon and Costco fight is that it's two behemoths going up against each other. And Costco, they've got bricks and mortars. They're not just the whack-a-mole, the small counterfeits and very, very murky distribution and murky ways that products get onto the streets, as it were. They're not getting onto the streets, they're getting into Costco. And it's a really important distinction. It comes down to reputation. And that's what a lot of these large brands are really trying to protect. They're using their intellectual property rights in order to protect their brand and their reputation. And it becomes really, really important to do so because that's really what the basis is for a lot of their valuations and the underpinning reputation of what their goods and services are in the market.
Susan, is there anything you want to add there to the Costco Lululemon dispute?
Sure. When Lululemon brought this action, I imagine a whiteboard with all of the areas of intellectual property and the lawyers trying to figure out how many claims they could possibly squeeze into one lawsuit. There are a dozen different claims. They involve warm-up jackets, they involve men's trousers, they involve trademarks and patents. They involve it within the trademark realm. They involve some of the design aspects of the garment that are very distinctive, but also some words like scuba
Hmm.
or the name of the color, Tidewater
Right.
teal. So
Hmm.
lots and lots in this one case.
We've got to go to break now, but we will be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing dupes and counterfeit in fashion. Now, Susan, how do fashion designers or companies decide whether it's going to be worth pursuing legal action against a manufacturer or a retailer of a dupe of their product?
Wonderful question, Christine. It's a question that brands ask themselves all the time, and a lot of it comes down to cost benefit analysis. Is it worth spending the money to bring the claim, and how successful are you likely to be in that claim? You don't actually have to win, you just have to at least be able to settle or to convince everybody else not to copy you because you're likely to be litigious about it. So there are different ways to win other than winning in court, but a lot of it comes down to money.
Now, I imagine one of the big challenges in this area of litigation that companies might consider when they're deciding, do I sue over this dupe, is the fact that many dupes and counterfeit products are produced overseas. Can Canadian or American brands realistically sue a foreign manufacturer or a website that operates entirely outside the jurisdiction of the United States or Canada and might have very weak intellectual property regimes? And when these companies producing the dupes or counterfeits might be these kind of fly by night operations where they just pop up and disappear, Elizabeth.
It becomes very difficult to enforce. But just because it's difficult, it doesn't necessarily mean that companies can't afford to do it. What it becomes is an extension of their brand management. So, what happens if you have a market that's flooded with a bunch of counterfeits or dupes? And let's go to the counterfeits really briefly first. It becomes an issue of brand dilution. Then all of a sudden, there are people that are walking around the streets that look and feel with products that look and feel like they've been sourced. But if you take a closer look at it, you're thinking, oh, wait a second. When did Louis Vuitton start making bags that don't stack up to its well known quality? So you almost have to go after those whack a mole type manufacturers to ensure that you've got the best quality products out there and that are real and that are genuine from a brand protection perspective. Dupes are a bit of a different story. The dupe issue is where you may not necessarily know that it is coming from a different manufacturer, but there are elements of the dupe that associate in the mind of a consumer that good or product with the manufacturer, pardon me, not with the manufacturer, with the brand. And if the brand's not protecting and not using and enforcing its rights, it will affect its reputation.
Now, one of the other questions I have is about potential liability for some of these e-commerce platforms. Um, the biggest one that most of us probably use are Amazon, but there's also Shein, AliExpress, where you know that these are items that are manufactured overseas and shipped to Canada. How much liability or responsibility might these platforms bear for facilitating the sale of dupes or even counterfeit? Are they liable if they fail to screen out products? Have there been successful lawsuits brought against any of them, Susan?
The earliest cases in this area came against eBay, so in the US, Europe, and elsewhere. And actually, eBay was pretty successful because their argument was it was Tiffany that brought the US case. Their argument was we know that a bunch of the Tiffany silver jewelry on our site is counterfeit, but we're not jewelers and we don't take possession of the product, so we don't know which 30% or 70%, depending on which party you ask. So where the law came down ultimately is platforms are liable if they are informed by the brands that something is counterfeit and don't take it down. However, it's not up to the platforms to figure out what is and is not the case. That could change going forward with AI coming to bear, and the law could change in that area, but it hasn't yet.
Yeah, I mean, I've actually
Christine,
seen. Yeah, go ahead, Elizabeth.
yeah, just jumping in really quickly on this, it's been very interesting. And since those eBay days and with the disputes with Tiffany, most of these party platforms have very robust policing notice and counter notice where there is an obligation to have those counterfeits taken down. So they will actually, when you get notice from a brand, and if it's unauthorized product, will take affirmative steps to remove it from their platform. And that becomes a really powerful tool.
They
Well,
work closely with the brands.
one thing I have seen though is on some of these e-commerce platforms, not the ones that I just mentioned, they'll have a counterfeit item and the logo is blurred out. And then you only see in the reviews of the comments that this is a counterfeit product because they encourage the reviews. We've got to go to commercial break, but we'll be right back. Welcome to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing the law around fashion dupes. Now, Elizabeth, from a consumer protection perspective, is there any potential for making consumer protection or misleading consumers the basis of legal action? Or do you think that's sort of precluded by the fact that consumers probably know they're not getting real Tiffany jewelry for $25?
Well, listen, consumer protection is baked into the policy behind a lot of the trademark, well, behind the trademark regime. And that, as Susan has already told you and your audience, is a really important factor in enforcement of the rights. What does that mean? That means that under trademarks, when there's a mark that's applied to goods, there is a Coca-Cola logo on a bottle in the consumer's mind, wherever that Coke is purchased, whether it's here in Canada, in South Africa, in wherever in the world, there is an expectation that the product in that bottle is the exact same wherever you buy it because it ties back to the source of the goods. And so that's the basis of the trademark. So it becomes really important that reputation underpinning and the goodwill that has been accrued to that brand should flow back to that brand. When dupes come into play, absolutely the misleading aspect of consumer of misleading the consumer is a huge factor and really one of the main factors that would make a brand decide to enforce their rights.
Now, Susan, one of the things that's really interesting about this whole conversation about dupes is the bigger policy conversation and sort of the ethics around fast fashion, because dupes are really part of the fast fashion industry, which has concerns about labor practices, waste, as well as environmental harm. How do you think dupes fit into that whole conversation? And do you think that there's some kind of even complicity among consumers for buying dupes, even if they're not necessarily illegal?
Great questions. Yes, we know that the fast fashion industry creates lots of issues. And if a name is not on a label so that a company is not standing behind it, we worry even more about labor practices and other shady activity. So there's that. From the consumer's perspective, the focus on dupes has changed dramatically. We are in an era of dupe culture. 10 years ago, even, if you had a dupe or a knockoff, you probably, as a consumer, tried to pass it off as the real thing, and you might be a little embarrassed or ashamed. Now people go on social media and show off their dupes. So there's a big problem that the brands are facing in that regard because of this shift in perception.
I mean, there are literally whole news articles written about the best dupes to find on various websites. So we definitely are in a dupe culture right now. Uh, Elizabeth, on a policy, from a policy's perspective, so one of the classic questions about intellectual property is, does it stifle innovation or does it spur innovation? I mean, what impact do you think dupes are going to have? Do they encourage designers to keep on their toes and keep creating new products for the market? Or does it, if their intellectual property can be stolen, is it more a disincentive to try anything new?
Well, look, innovation and creativity does not happen in a vacuum. That's not the way that that new ideas and riffs off of or improvements off of the existing infrastructure and world. Those matter. That foundation really does matter. It's that fine line between problematic imitation and new and creative innovation. And so ultimately, what you have to ask yourself is, does the product or the good or the right in that, does it warrant protection? Is it something that is so intrinsic to the brand and associates, back to the consumer protection piece, associates in the mind of the consumer what that thing is, who that thing is coming from, what brand does that awesome dress come from, or those shoes, and is someone inappropriately and parasitically trying to trade off of that existing goodwill? There is no question that there should be imitation that spurs that innovation. It's just when that imitation is in by its very nature solely a parasitic thing. The scale and the spectrum is a very sliding one, so it completely depends on the investments that are made into developing your brand and your culture and your relationship with your clients.
Hmm.
Just to
We've
add to that very briefly, if you're a small designer, you can be driven straight out of business by dupes, and you can't innovate if your company is shut down.
Great points, both of you. We've got to go to commercial break now, but when we come back, I want to talk about how it's possible that dupes are being made so quickly. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing dupes in fashion and their legal status. Now, Susan, one of the things that's been fascinating in this sort of dupe culture, as you've described it, is that I will see a picture of a celebrity post a picture of herself in a dress. I mean, a classic example is Kim Kardashian. And the next day, I will see ads for knockoff versions of this dress being sold online by these dupe sellers. How is it possible that they are able to copy and mass produce these influencer looks so quickly?
Copying used to take months. Now it takes hours and sometimes does not even involve human hands touching the product or very minimally.
Did you know like how they're actually doing it? Like what's the mechanism? Either Susan or Elizabeth, either of you could chime in here.
Well, I have a client, and for many years, and back to what Susan says, it used to take months, and then it gets shorter and shorter and shorter, and now it absolutely takes hours right after a runway show, and we're talking very intricate, very expensive couture. All of a sudden, it's popping up on well-known counterfeit knockoff sites, and what happens is the technology associated with patterning, because it comes down to patterning, and a lot of the patterns used to be done by hand, and there was whole swaths of professionals who would hand draw the pattern, and it was done by hand. That's not the case anymore. And quite simply, you could scan a dress in a number of different photos, make some assumptions about who the model is, and not who the model is rather, but the size of the model, the weight of the model, the height of the model, and very quickly come up with an imitation by extrapolating what the dress looks like and how it's framed on that person in an image. You don't need your hands on the product anymore.
Wow, it's totally incredible that we're at that level technologically, although it obviously raises these legal and ethical concerns. Now, Susan, one of the sort of ethical or policy arguments I've heard in favor of dupes is that it is a way to democratize fashion. It makes things that would be otherwise inaccessible to people accessible, and it challenges elitism in the industry. Do you have any take on that?
I'm more concerned about the democratization of being able to get into fashion from a business perspective, right? Can you afford to start a company? Can you take all of the education that you have accrued and all of the student loans you've taken out and all of the internships you've done and put that to good use in the economy? So I think that there is always going to be inexpensive clothing available. I don't think we have a shortage in that regard, but we do have a shortage of opportunities. So democratizing those opportunities is what I think about first.
Yeah, I mean, if anything, we have a surplus of inexpensive clothing right now. Um, Elizabeth, do you think that fashion intellectual property laws could be strengthened in some way to better protect against dupes? Or do you think that that might have unforeseen consequences that might do more harm than good? Or do you think it's really comes down to jurisdiction and enforceability?
I think that it's that we are in Canada and the U.S. The regimes are very, very similar, very, very similar, and there are robust tools that are available to brands to be able to police and enforce their rights. The challenge is the accessibility in order to do so. The just accessing the justice system is not cheap in any way, shape, or form, and it's even more daunting when you look to enforcement in the U.S. It's about 10 times the price tag as enforcement in Canada. And so the tools are there, but the tools are also predominantly and practically accessible only to those large brands that have the war chest to do it and the reason to do it because they've got the value of their brand and their stock prices part and parcel to that consideration. It becomes very difficult if there was any robust or tightening in any of the laws. It would predominantly affect the ability for smaller organizations and smaller designers to be able to enforce their rights. The framework is there, though, Christine.
Europe does a lot better than we do. Canada's a little better than the US, but we are very envious of the more robust protections elsewhere.
Well, that's all the time we have. I want to thank you both so much. We've heard today about fashion dupes and the challenges with enforcing intellectual property law, especially in the new, rapidly moving and international industry of fast fashion. Do you buy fashion dupes? Do you think they make fashion more accessible, or do they come with legal and ethical problems? You be the judge. Thanks for watching, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.